In the media, you'll see about the prefrontal cortex, but it can actually be subdivided into different areas. So here we've got the right hemisphere rather than the left, so this is the front of the brain. We've got rostral or anterior, meaning front of the prefrontal cortex. Ventral, meaning like belly, because animals mostly go around like this rather than being stood up. So when we talk about dorsal, we mean like a dorsal fin on a fish. So when I say dorso or dorsal, that means like the top of the brain. Ventral, meaning belly, is like the bottom of the brain. Lateral is the sides of the brain, and then medial is the centre. Okay, so neurologists, these are the doctors that actually treat these people and save their lives if they've had a brain injury, have identified a number of subcortical circuits, or frontal subcortical circuits, which are areas of the frontal cortex that are linked up to other parts of the brain. And briefly, we've got an anterior cingulate cortex thing, I'll show you all pictures later on, a dorsolateral syndrome, an orbitofrontal syndrome, and this rostral or anterior prefrontal cortex, which is also called Brodmann's area 10 or the frontal pole. And then there are also injuries to the amygdala, which are two little almond-shaped nuclei of neurons in the anterior temporal lobes, and a white matter tract called the uncinate fasciculus. That's a lot to take in, but I'm just going to do them one by one. Okay, if people have damage to the anterior cingulate, I'll show you a picture of this later on, the anterior cingulate is between the two lobes of the brain, and it sits astride the corpus callosum, which is the part that links together the two hemispheres. So if people have damage to the anterior, that means the front of the cingulate cortex, then they have these sorts of problems. They can be very apathetic, and they don't seem to apparently want to do anything. They can have abulia, which is a lack of willpower, so anything that requires any determination, they might not want to do. Perhaps as a result of those, they can seem very socially withdrawn. In extreme cases, they can have a condition called akinetic mutism, which is a lack of movement in speech, even though they are capable of moving and speaking, and there's no damage to movement or speech areas. They just don't seem to want to do it. And you can get people that will sit there in total silence. Apparently, people that have recovered from akinetic mutism have reported effectively having no emotions and no desire to move or speak. So that's probably why. So that's more the cognition as opposed to the behaviour. Now, I've only met one person with this anterior cingulate syndrome, and what he will do is he will quite happily sit there for hours at a time in his chair. He'll just stare, just apparently at total peace, and there just doesn't seem to be any will to want to initiate any kind of action. He can actually speak. I've heard him speak once in the last 5 years I've known him. Not that I see him that regularly. And that was when we were doing a quiz and he answered a question about football. We were all amazed because it's the first time he'd said anything. So it's a total lack of initiation of behaviour. And to show you the anterior cingulate cortex, so this is the right hemisphere of the brain, but we're looking at it as if we've chopped the brain in half. So this is like the medial section. So this is the anterior cingulate cortex, meaning the front part of the cingulate, which is example there, and the CC is showing you the corpus callosum that links the two hemispheres. And here's another double dissociation for you. Other studies, in fact a meta-analysis of other studies, have shown that more emotional tasks seem to be at the anterior part of the anterior cingulate cortex, so the front of the front, whereas the more emotional tasks seem to be in the more dorsal areas. And what this seems to suggest is critical to our pain, because apparently...
Sorry, did you say emotional twice then? You did, yes.
Oh, did I? Did I? Oh, so is it... Let me get this right. Yes, emotional here, and then red dots are cognitive. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I don't want to confuse people. Yeah, so the more emotional tasks seem to be involved with the front of the anterior cingulate cortex, and the more cognitive tasks seem to be involved in the more dorsal areas. And one of these apparently is the Stroop test that I had you do earlier. So it's the ability to inhibit some automatic behaviours. Now, what they're suggesting it's critical to is pain and error detection, because apparently people that have this syndrome, I've never done this and never would actually, apparently you can prick them with a needle on like their finger and they'll just sit there and just not bothered by it. And apparently people that have recovered have reported saying, I could feel the pain, but it didn't bother me. So that's showing like a conscious dissociation between physically experiencing the pain and an affective or emotional reaction to it. Other researchers, and this is just to show you the debate, these are all eminent professors, or certainly these chaps are. Donald Stoos in Canada suggests that it's energization of executive function, which is the word for self-control, whereas Gilbert and Burgess talk about it as being detecting the need for cognitive control. I actually can't see how you would dissociate those two, really, because they both can have the same effect. Yeah?
I've got a bit of a crap question. Is there any way in which the triggers to where people store these things in the first place during their development years are due to some random trigger that we can't understand, in the same way that if somebody moves, and this is going to be a completely crap layman's example, moves into a 2-bedroom flat or a 2-room flat, and they decide one room's going to be the dining room, one's going to be the living room.
Oh, do you mean, is there a reason why these things seem to appear in certain areas of the brain?
Is there some reason that somebody completely different?
In some cases, there's like good reasons. So say like Wernicke's area, being in the temporal lobe, which is responsible for auditory cognition, makes sense. Because it makes sense for the part of your brain that understands language to be next to the part of your brain that processes all the sounds and auditory information. So it makes sense that it would arise there. Having said that, the brain is pretty plastic, and sometimes in early brain damage, you can get it where people will have their cognitive functions in slightly different areas. And the brain surgeons tell us that no matter what the neuroscientists tell us, the brain surgeons say that people's brains are as individual as their face. And any person that you need to operate on, you need to check that the areas are in exactly the same place as normal. Apparently it's only 90% of people have language on the left hemisphere. So there could be some people that have language in other areas. So, okay, right, so I'll move you swiftly onwards then. So that's the anterior cingulate syndrome. Oh yeah, Ron?
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
Does that mean that that athletes that they say push through the pain barrier?
Yeah.
Does that mean that those type of athletes, the ones that the top athletes, are they somehow brain damaged or something?
I wouldn't necessarily say that they're brain damaged. I mean, you know about people talk about the runner's high, which is possibly endorphins, possibly endocannabinoids. I was going to ask David Pearce if he was here, because he's very interested in suffering and brain chemistry, and he'd probably be able to answer this question better than I can, as to whether there are opioid receptors in the anterior cingulate cortex, because I suspect it's probably full of them, but unfortunately I didn't have time to look up that as a reference. It was something I thought of looking up though. If you give somebody heroin, the opioids stick to receptors in this place. Is that what causes that response, or are those receptors elsewhere? But effectively it has a similar kind of effect. Okay, so I'll go on. Okay, so the next one being the dorsolateral syndrome. Okay, people that have damage to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortices, and these are sort of here in your brain, this sort of area, okay, whereas the anterior cingulate cortex is between the two folds of the brain, are disorganised with respect to the environment, and they can be distractible, and they lack the ability to make complicated plans, okay? So what they can do is they can either lack control of their working memory, that's what WM stands for, in which case they can't control what the content of their working memory is. So they might get distracted by things from their environment, or distracted by random tangential thoughts in their own brain, which is very much what I'm like. Alternatively, people can have an impaired capacity of working memory, which means that the actual amount of stuff that they can think about at any one given period of time is much smaller. And this limits the complexity of ideas that we can sort of think about. So, to give you an example, say if you're thinking about politics, and you go, okay, so there's like Republican politics, and then there's Democrat politics, and then Republicans think this, this, and this, and Democrats think this, this, and this. But the resultant of those two political oppositions coming in and out of office is these kind of things. If you can't hold very much stuff in your brain, sort of online and active at any one period of time, then there's a limit to how much information you can actually hold. I was going to do a little working memory test with somebody here, but I don't know if we'll have time to do it. Has anybody ever done a digit span aspect of an IQ test? Has anyone ever done that? Okay, so a digit span is the amount of digits that you can hold in your head in your sort of short-term memory. So if you're telling somebody a telephone number, you don't give them all 11 digits of a telephone number, you'll break it up into like sort of 4 or 5 numbers in little chunks. And the reason for this is that people can't, not many people, can hold 11 digits in their short-term memory before they have to write it down, or learn it off by heart, like you might know your mum's phone number off by heart or something. Now, the average amount of digits that people can hold in their brain is about 7 digits, and this is like being replicated massively and all over the world. The standard deviation is about 2 digits, meaning that about 2/3 of the population can hold between 5 and 9 digits of information, or chunks of information, or it could be words, for example, in their brain at any one given period of time. Obviously, you can remember things in your long-term memory. That's a different sort of memory. Now, if you could remember 4 or less, you're probably in the bottom 6th for that ability, and if you can remember 10 or more, you're going to be in the top 6th of this ability of working memory. And interestingly, working memory is one of the aspects of an IQ test that correlates most highly with overall IQ. And it's probably one of the things that's responsible for general intelligence, because basically the more working memory you've got, the more complicated an idea you can hold in your head at any one period of time. Okay? So a slight analogy could be to talk about it as being like RAM in your computer. So the capacity of your working memory would be like how much RAM you've actually got in there. Whereas the content of your working memory could be all the programs and stuff that were running on it. And obviously, as we know, if you've got 50 windows open, your computer performance starts to drop. Yeah, you first?
Yeah, presumably there's a distinction between digit span working memory and other kinds.
Yes,
yeah,
there is. There's
could be good with words,
auditory working
yeah.
memory, which
yeah,
is what we're using when we're talking. There's also visual working memory, and it's interesting you should say that. Go on quickly.
Crap question. What if you automatically have already done a mnemonic thing whereby you associate certain numbers with certain, I don't know, issues?
That's basically a strategy, and that strategy
but how does
might...
that work when it's somebody who's already been brain damaged and they've been doing that? Does it kind of affect that, or does it just affect the others?
Strategies would be something we would use with people with brain damage to help them deal with that. So, I'll give you an example.
Is strategy damage though if they've already developed it?
No, strategies are something that you tend to use in the moment, if you see what I mean. Like, you could have a habit of using a certain strategy, but that's a long-term memory, if you see what I mean.
This is why synesthetes have such good memory with numbers. And
yeah, because they can effectively use the strategy.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an
they
example.
have an emotional association, and that's more memorable than arbitrary symbols.
Yeah, emotional association in the short term is going to be harder than in the long term. Like, you could have an emotional association for remembering a long-term memory, but to immediately form an emotional association with, say, anything I've said today.
But in terms of something like patterns of numbers, those emotions will have actually
oh, sorry, in a synesthete you mean?
They will have lodged the same connections over many, many years. So whenever those patterns reappear, they'll be well versed in actually remembering that particular chunk.
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. I mean, it's a pretty extreme example, but yeah,
I appreciate it for very few people. Yeah.
Okay, so just to give you an example of some people with problems with working memory, let's check how much time we've got here. Yep, that's okay. So some problems with working memory, you could have somebody with a limited capacity for working memory, and they would not be capable of understanding long sentences, or complicated descriptions. Like if you said, can you go upstairs, get dressed, clean your teeth, come back down, put the dog outside, and then have your breakfast. You could say that to most kids and they'd get that. But that actually might be too complicated for somebody with this sort of brain injury to be able to remember all of those things. So I have to say, go upstairs, and then as a strategy, when they get into the bathroom, it says, if it's the morning, clean your teeth. You actually have that written next to the mirror, because they can't hold these things in their mind. In contrast to that, you can have somebody with poor control of their working memory, which means that they're very distractible, and they might have lots of things come into their working memory, which even though it's of large capacity, might get full with the sort of junk that we need to kind of screen out. And when people talk about information overload in the modern age, this is that we need to have good attentional filters to keep our working memory pristine to actually do something with it. If you could imagine a computer without a pop-up blocker that ended up with 50 windows of garbage, okay, that would be a nice analogy. Okay, so I was going to do the working memory test, but I don't think I really have the time to do it. But it's just to say that what you can do is you can do this with a friend. You can see how many numbers you can remember in a row. If you can remember 10 or more, you're probably in the top 6th of the population for working memory. Also, see how many of those numbers you can remember and repeat backwards correctly. And if you can remember, I think it's about 8 or more, you're in the top 6th for working memory. Basically, it contributes to a lot of higher cognitive functions, because the more stuff you can hold in your brain at any one given time, the more complicated an idea you can think about. So hence it's critical to intelligence as well as to executive function, which is a psychological term for self-control, basically. Okay, so just to show you the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this comes into, did you say a visual as well as